I'm Dr. Addie Dove. I am from down at UCF. I am in the physics department there. I'm an assistant professor. I'm in the Planetary Sciences group. So my research focuses on planetary science research. So it focuses on the bodies in our solar system primarily, specifically what we call airless bodies in the solar system. So not things like Earth and Mars that have nice atmospheres. Instead, things like the moon and asteroids that have these really exposed surfaces that don't have any atmospheres to protect them. So I'm going to talk about one of my favorite things to talk about today, which is dust. I know it's very exciting. Everybody's always really excited when you say, I'm going to talk about dust today. And I'm not talking about the dust that's like in the air here that I can see between me and the projector, or that's like on your computer monitors or whatever, right? I'm going to talk about dust that is actually rock that covers the surfaces of most of these planetary bodies. And it sounds super boring when you say you're going to talk about dust, but I'm going to try to make it a little bit less boring, and talk about what we see on these planetary surfaces, how we know that dust moves around, how it interacts with the environments. I think last week, if any of you came to the seminar last week, I think Dr. Cannon talked a lot about developing simulants. Was that what he was talking about? I don't know if you were here. Yeah, he was developing simulants. So we have a lab at UCF where we develop fake moon dust and asteroid dust to use for testing. So I'm going to talk a bunch about what these surfaces look like and how we understand them. And as we said, go ahead and ask questions during. It's a pretty informal talk. I mostly have a lot of images because those are the best ways to sort of illuminate what we're talking about. So I just like to start out with a little bit of some images of the lunar surface. So I think these are going to automatically appear, but apparently not. There we go. Okay, so these are different images of the lunar surface, just showing sort of the dynamic environment that's there. So when we look up at the moon, it's the only body that I'm going to talk about today that you can really sort of typically see with your eye. We see that there's sort of these features on the surface that are dark areas and light areas. We see cratering is the really sort of dominant process you see on the lunar surface. And it's actually one of the dominant processes for most of the bodies we're going to be talking about here. And it creates these really complex surfaces. So we see in the previous image, right, you can see there's this shiny crater here. It's a relatively fresh crater, and it has this bright white material that's sort of been excavated from underneath due to this high energy impact. And then it's spread out in these rays among the surface. And you can see there's probably some boulders and other things scattered around there too. This is a zoomed in image of another crater where you can see these really complex features on the surface and lots of different features that spread out away from the crater, and also maybe some like other crater features underneath. We also see these really complex environments on the moon and asteroids where you have topography differences, so sometimes created by craters, sometimes created by just slopes and fractures and things like that on the surface that cause some parts to be really well illuminated and then some parts to be completely in the dark. And if you think about it, like when you're here in Florida, right, or anywhere on Earth, which is where most people tend to be, if you're in the sun, right, if you're directly in the sun, you're experiencing the solar heat, you feel this heating, and if you go into the shade, it gets a little bit cooler. That's more true in places like Colorado, where I used to live, where usually it's not as humid. You feel that temperature difference a little bit more. When it's more humid out, right, you feel that temperature difference less. So when you go into the shade, you're like, oh, it's a little bit cooler, but it's not that much better. But then if it's less humid, you feel that difference really dramatically. So if you think about being on the lunar surface or on an asteroid or something like that, where there's no atmosphere to insulate you, if you go into these dark areas, some really crazy things can happen. It can get really cold, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of the other processes that happen as you go between day and light on these planetary surfaces. Here's another cool example where you have these strewn boulder fields and then all this sort of smooth looking areas. That's mostly dust. Pretty exciting. And then you get these cool shadowing and, again, topography effects. I think this is one of the final ones here. We have this cool effect where you have this shadow. So we're down in a crater or something, but you have this little boulder sticking up. It's higher than the surrounding region, so it's still getting illuminated. So you can think about some crazy, these little two boulders here like talking to each other. on the surface. And then finally, I like to have this image because this is actually one of the Apollo landers. I think it's 17, but I might be wrong. Is it in my notes? 16. It's Apollo 16. And this is actually the Apollo lander on the surface of the moon. So this image was taken from a spacecraft we currently have orbiting around the moon called the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. And it has this pretty high resolution camera that can take images of the surface. So here's the lander, and you see these tracks here. These are all actually tracks from the astronauts walking around and driving their little lunar buggy on the surface. So we can see that they left these tracks and scoured the surface and changed the surface as they moved around. This little feature over here, I think, is an instrument suite that they left on the surface. Okay, so I mentioned dust. It's a fun thing to talk about. Sometimes astronomers hate it when you talk about dust, because if people who are astronomers that are looking pretty far out into space, dust tends to get in the way of things. But I like talking about dust because it's on the surfaces of things. I mean, it's definitely something we're going to interact with as we go and explore these other solar system bodies. So dust is on many planetary surfaces. It's the finest part of the surface. So it happens when you break up rocks on the surface, you produce this dust. And we call it regolith, which is actually my preferred word. But so it's called regolith, which just means broken up rock here on the surface. And typically, those rocks, as they're broken up, get broken up due to impacts, so really high energy impacts that create the craters we see, but also little micrometeorite impacts, so you have little tiny things that come and bang into the surface and break rocks apart. And as we're starting to learn, there might be other processes such as thermal changes. So if you think about, you have these rocks on the surface and they're in this really extreme thermal environment where it goes from hot to cold, you can get a lot of expansion and contraction of the rocks that can cause cracks along inside of the rock and actually break the rock apart that way. So there's actually probably thermal fracturing, we call it, that creates some of these surface features as well. One of the really interesting things about this soil that builds up, this dust and this rock that builds up, is that we see it happens in, we see a lot of formation of smooth areas in craters, and I'll show a lot more examples of this. We see distributions where you have boulders, and we also know from when the astronauts went to the moon that this really fine dust behaves very differently than like sand or your typical dirt that you have here on Earth. You can see the astronauts stepped into the regolith here, and the boot print was very firm. It compacted very easily. And so this is a feature of the dust we see, is that it compacts differently than we expect and sort of behaves more like you might think of like flour or maybe even wet sand or something like that. So there's all these really interesting things that happen on the surface. So we have a picture here of an asteroid called Itokawa. Oops, sorry. So this is an asteroid. It's a little cut off here, but it's this funny sort of potato-shaped asteroid. And this was observed by a mission called Hayabusa a few years ago. It was a Japanese mission to this asteroid. And so this is a pretty tiny little asteroid, but it has these crazy surface features where you have a lot of these bouldery regions and then these really smooth areas. And if we zoom in on one of the areas that actually looks pretty smooth right there, you can see that it in itself also is pretty bouldery. So here's a 1 meter scale bar, right? So a lot of these rocks are several meters across, but you can see that there's fine material that's maybe tens of centimeters. And so even though it looks super smooth here, it's actually made up of sort of crushed up bits of rock. And there's probably the really fine, really granular dust underneath that, or mixed in with that, right? It's filling in sort of all the spaces in between. So we have a lot of spacecraft observations, and we're getting more and more now. I'll show a couple in a minute that are exciting, hot off the presses images of asteroids. But we have a lot of spacecraft observations of these small body surfaces that tell us that they're very complex. They have these really dusty environments, and they're composed of lots of different sizes of things. And we actually think that a lot of asteroids, like this thing here, are what we call rubble piles. So the Earth, Mars, the Moon, things like that, are these sort of spherical bodies that are cohesive throughout. So they're held together and they're gravitationally stuck together, and you have this really smooth feature from the inside to the outside. We think things like rubble piles are maybe just what it sounds like, right? Where you have a bunch of rock that you sort of smoosh together at some point, and it cohesively sticks together, and these these piles of rocks stick together, but it's not necessarily like a gravitational sticking together. They're just sort of there until something else comes and hits them, probably. So it's actually this sort of loosely bound material. There's no glue holding it together. Well, the glue is maybe dust, actually, it turns out. Sneak peek. So there's lots of processes that we think happen to create these features that we see, to move dust around, and to create what we see on the surface. So impacts is a big one, obviously, no pun intended. So you have really big impacts, you have little micrometeorite impacts, those really drive what happens on the surface. Not only in creating the dust that we see, but also if you have an impact, you have a lot of ejecta, it goes all over the place, it can move things all around the surface. We also see landslides on some surfaces. So we see what we call mass wasting or landslide features. There's also a lot of processes, which is what I do a lot of research into electrostatic motion. So that means charged particles. So these little dust grains can get charges on them, like buildup of electrons on their surfaces, and they can maybe move around on the surface. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then again, some thermal cracking. This picture down here is a picture from another asteroid called Eros that has this sort of smooth looking surface, and as you go in closer you see these sort of craters that are filled in the bottom. These are called ponds. So we see these pond features on some asteroids like Eros where you have this really smooth material that's filling in the bottom of the crater. And so naturally that wouldn't necessarily be the case. So we think that there are processes that move this material down into the crater. So is it landslides? Is it sort of falling off the edges here and piling up in the bottom? Is it due to particles jumping from other places on the asteroid and landing there? How does that happen? So there's lots of questions about how these surfaces form and how they evolve that we try to answer with experiments and models and observations of the surfaces. I think I just said all of those things. Here's another picture of Itokawa from the other end. This is from the little short end. It's got the stubby little head. I don't know. A lot of these asteroids are crazy. There's some that look like ducks, and there's some that look like funky potatoes, and I don't know, all sorts of crazy things. This is another picture of the Eros surface. So you can see you have these sort of boulders and then these really smooth pond areas. And just for scale, right? So this whole asteroid, the resolution isn't great for some reason. This whole asteroid is only 540 meters across, whereas Eros is a much, much bigger asteroid, and you can see even just this region is 350 meters. So we have these very different scales of bodies that we look at too. And then to zoom in really, really far, this is a dust grain. So this is a lunar dust grain. This is a 100 micron scale bar, so 10 to the minus 6. So this is a very small particle, but this is a representative particle of what we think of the finest bits are on these surfaces. So when you look at this, right, you think of like dust, you think of sort of sand that we have here on Earth. Sand is very rounded, it's very smooth, because sand is produced by rocks being broken down, but then erosion, right, sort of moving it around and breaking it up and smoothing it out. So a lot of the sand and the other dust grains we have here on Earth are these really smooth particles that are going to behave very differently than if you have these crazy jagged things and these weird surfaces with pockets and all sorts of little bits hanging off the side. The other kind of dust we have here on Earth, right, when we say dust, is actually organic dust, right? So all the stuff floating around in the air and all the things on the floor, that's actually like organic dust. And it turns out that that's sort of similar sizes and kind of behaves electrically like a lot of the dust grains we see here. So the fact that it clings onto your computer is because it has these little surface forces that help it cling on to your computer screen or whatever. And we look at those sort of same processes happening on these little tiny dust grains on planetary surfaces. Okay, so I promised some hot off the presses pictures. My friend put this little comparison together. So there's 2 missions right now that are going to asteroids that are currently, one of them is at the asteroid and one of them is approaching in the next month. So Ryugu is an asteroid right here that is a target of Hayabusa 2. So Itokawa was visited by Hayabusa 1. This Ryugu asteroid is visited by Hayabusa 2. So Japan's got these really cool asteroid missions that they've been doing recently. And so Ryugu, they just got to it about, I don't know, a couple months ago, maybe 3 months ago, and they've been taking these crazy awesome high resolution images of the asteroid. And before, I should have had the before picture. So before we went to either of these asteroids, they're always like ground-based images that are like 1 pixel. So you just know the asteroid looks like a little blob. You're like, oh, there's a shiny dot, right? It's a little fuzzy. Maybe it has some sort of shape that we can get from some data, but we don't ever know exactly what it's going to look like until we get close. So we got these first images of Ryugu back, and we had a pretty good idea of what this other asteroid Bennu looked like. And if you look at them, they're like almost the same. And so they first got to Ryugu and I was like, oh no, they went to the wrong asteroid. But it's okay, they didn't. They went to the correct asteroid. This one's actually a lot bigger. It's about twice the size. And it's got this super interesting surface where you sort of see this ridge here along the center. It's got this crater that, again, like that shouldn't be there if this body was a cohesive body, if it was one big structure. So this sort of points to the fact that it might be a rubble pile where you had something hit it and it sort of absorbed the energy. If you think about it, like if you have a little like beanbag or something, right, and you punch it, you can sort of make a hole, but it sort of absorbs the energy, versus if you had something that was more cohesive, you could break it apart. And you got these interesting boulders and rocks, and I'll show another picture of this one in a second. And now we have Bennu, which is an asteroid that OSIRIS-REx is going to. So OSIRIS-REx launched from here at the Cape a few years ago now. I forget how long ago it was. And it's a pretty awesome mission. Both of these missions are actually going to go down and touch the surface and try to bring back a sample from these asteroids. This is super exciting. The only samples we really have from other planetary bodies are from a couple of comets, one other asteroid, so Itokawa, and the moon. But we're actually going to get more samples back now of different types of asteroids so we can actually poke and prod and look what they're composed of. But so Bennu, this is the best picture we have so far of Bennu because OREX is still getting there. It should be there in about a month. Ooh, that was exciting. The resolution's so weird on these, I don't know. So Hayabusa 2 again is at Ryugu. So these are 2 different sides of the asteroid. You can see there's this like crazy boulder up here, up at the top, that's just sort of sitting there on the surface. And then all these little bouldery features. But this asteroid is actually much chunkier than we expected. We expected more small grains to be able to see on the surface, but you actually have this really sort of chunky material where we don't see a lot of the really fine stuff. So there's this question of where is it? Is it sort of entrained underneath? Is it stuck on these bigger particles? It's hard to tell. So Hayabusa 2 is actually, it has like 4 different landers that it's sending down. So one of them was called Mascot, and it went down to the surface, and then it had a couple of other little hoppers that sort of deployed and did a couple of measurements and then went to sleep. But so one of them went down right about here on the surface, and so as it was going down, they found this little landing area, and I'll have a zoomed in image later of this sort of outcrop that we see. But this is cool because so this is the asteroid, it's illuminated because the sun, if I'm the spacecraft, I'm taking this picture, the sun is back behind me, right, illuminating the asteroid. So then you get to this one, and it's super cool because actually, right, the sun's behind me, that's the shadow of the spacecraft. So it's a fun little selfie on the asteroid surface. And you can kind of see that shadow. It's like right there, I think. Okay, so I promised the zoomed in version, right? So here's that outcrop we were just looking at. So this is really great resolution, right? This is 1 meter resolution. So you have this crazy outcrop, and you can see it's all this bouldery material. It's very rocky. So there is a lot of this fine-grained material, but it's got to be stuck down underneath or something. And then this is a kind of trippy image, but it's from one of the landers. So the Mascot lander took this as it was landing. It actually there's a video you can look at online where it does a time lapse of these images as the sun sort of sets on the asteroid. And so you can see that sort of the illumination on this surface change. But this lander actually landed on the surface, and that's pretty gnarly to land on, right? Usually when we try to land spacecraft, we try to land them on nice smooth areas, and they got to Ryugu and they were like, uh-oh, this is gonna be rough, right? Literally. And so they had this, but fortunately these landers were sort of robust and could just land, sort of plop down on the surface somewhere. And they have some rockets and would slow down, and then they'd plop down. And so this one, it did pretty well. It landed on the surface. It took images for about a day, and then it was done. So we have lots of exciting missions coming up from asteroids. We have this one mission called LRO that's still orbiting around the moon, and lots of proposed missions to the other surfaces. And most of these are going to be robotic right now, so all of the asteroid missions for right now are robotic. But there's a lot of interest in also human exploration of these surfaces, maybe for using for mining and resources. If we're talking about the moon, it's to sort of look at living off-world and developing colonies and things like that. So there's a lot of interest in exploring these surfaces, both with humans and with robots. And so both for scientific purposes and for understanding for exploration, we have a lot of interest in understanding how these surfaces are made and how they change. And so now I'm just going to go through a few different types of experiments and things we do to look at these processes that move dust on the surface. And most of the stuff I'm going to talk about is experiments that we're actually doing at UCF or with some of my colleagues to understand these processes and how we modify planetary surfaces. So the first one I'll talk about is impacts, but not the crazy impacts that I was talking about where you have really high speed, like tens of kilometers per second, you have something slamming into a surface. Here I'm actually going to talk about low velocity impacts. So why do we care about low velocity impacts? Even though the things that are really changing the surface are those high velocity ones, when a really high velocity impact hits, right, it throws off a bunch of material. That material goes and hits the surface also, and you have these secondary impacts that are going to be at much slower speeds. Additionally, if we have robotic or human explorers on the surface, right, they're going and touching down on the surface, and they're going to be moving not at tens of kilometers per second, but hopping around on the surface or roving or plopping, right, and they're going to be moving at centimeters per second. So we want to understand how these different processes happen and what the interactions look like on the planetary surfaces. So this is a still frame from a video where we launched a marble into dirt. It's very technical experiments we do in the lab. We throw marbles at dirt, right? But it's much more technical than it sounds, but I like to say it that way anyway. So we launch marbles into dirt to look at the ejecta that comes off. And so if you were to take a rock outside and throw it into the dirt, right? If you were to do it from up here and throw it pretty hard, you would sort of see a little bit of material come up, right? And that's called ejecta. If you were to take a rock and sort of drop it from about 2 inches up onto the surface, what would happen? Not so much, right? You wouldn't see much. You'd be like, okay, well, the rock hit the surface. When you draw a marble from about 2 inches up and it hits the surface, it's moving at about 1 meter per second. So that's accelerating because it's falling on Earth, right? And it's hitting the surface at about 1 meter per second. That's actually really fast when it comes to the experiments we're doing. So this experiment here was actually done at about 40 centimeters per second. So half as slow as if I dropped it from this height, right? So that's really slow. So how do we get these crazy bits of ejecta that we see? If we're doing these experiments here on Earth, how do we get these things? Well, it turns out that we find ways to sort of negate gravity. So you don't get rid of gravity, but you remove the effects of gravity. And we do that by doing experiments in our lab in a drop tower. So this is a tower where we can raise an experiment up basically to the ceiling and drop it from the ceiling. And as it's falling, it's in free fall. So as it's in free fall, everything's sort of moving at the same speed, and you actually get what's called microgravity for 3/4 of a second or something like that. So an analogy, right, is who's ever been on something like the Tower of Terror or something like that. Have you been on the Tower of Terror? One of those things where you go up and then it drops you, right? Or if you've been in an elevator, that's a more common one, right? And you have that first little bit when it drops. So you know how you sort of feel your stomach come up and you sort of feel lighter for a second? That is a sort of the same free fall weightlessness that happens when we drop an experiment from the ceiling. It's actually the same thing that's happening to the astronauts up on the space station. So the space station is actually just falling all the time, right? So it's in free fall around the Earth. It's just falling at the right speed so that it always falls past the curve of the Earth and it's never actually falling down, right? But it is technically falling the whole time. That's all orbits are, or is like controlled falling. So as the space station is orbiting the Earth, the astronauts are also in this weightless zero-G environment. And it's basically because everything is moving at the same speed, so relative to each other, it doesn't seem like there's these big differences.
If an astronaut is in that spacecraft and falling all the time, then do they
So yeah, so the question is, do you always feel that stomach drop if you're the astronaut on the space station? And the answer is no, not really. So most of that is due to the change in acceleration. So when you're first falling, or like when you start your car, right, you're changing your acceleration. Once you're at that constant acceleration though, once you're falling constantly, you don't feel it the same way. So you sort of get used to it. It feels weird when you're in low gravity, but you get used to it and you don't feel that sort of up and down. The up and down happens from the change in your gravity and the change in your acceleration. I can't tell if the dust grains feel that or not, but they do feel changes in acceleration. So we also do experiments on what are called parabolic airplane flights. So these are flights where the airplane does parabolas. It's also known as the vomit comet. It's not a great name, but it's true. And so the airplane does parabolas. So as it's going over the top of its parabola, it's going into free fall, and you have about 30 seconds of this weightlessness. And now there are upcoming experiments and new flight providers that are starting to do what are called suborbital flights, which is basically they launch a capsule, it goes up, you have about 5 minutes of free fall of microgravity, and then the capsule comes back down. So we're getting into this new range of being able to do longer experiments too. But a lot of our experiments have been in the drop tower in the lab or on these airplane flights in low gravity. And so what that does is it allows us to do experiments at really low speeds and see what happens to the regolith that's ejected. So I'll start this video again in a second. This is a video that we did, so a little context. This is the experiment box. This is the airplane floor. Back behind it, here's somebody's foot. I think that's my hand. These are experiments that we've done on these airplane flights. So we use these flights to get this low gravity levels, but it turns out you can actually get sort of in between levels too. So we have some that we call asteroids, some that we call lunar, and then some that are sort of microgravity or zero gravity. So this first one is an asteroid gravity level. So you can see the box is sitting on the plane, on the floor, and we have this tray that opens. There's a tray of dust here. This is actually just sand, and then a marble that falls in and hits. So I'm going to replay, maybe. Well, there we go. So this impact is happening at, I don't remember exactly the speed, but somewhere around like 50 centimeters per second. It might have been a little bit slower. Some of our experiments were getting down to about 10 centimeters per second. And so it hits, and you can see this ejecta that comes up, right? That flows off of, let's try again. So you have this ejecta that comes and makes this nice curtain of ejecta around the marble. So you can see it sort of gets deposited all around the surface. So we have camera data from here and a little bit from above. You can see there's this mirror up here that we can look at from all different angles and see how that material is ejected, what speeds it's moving at, and how it's sort of distributed as it goes away from the marble. We can use these experiments to then model what would happen on the surface of an asteroid or on the surface of a moon and predict where material would be able to move. If we go to the next, that looks like the same thing. Okay, well, let's play it. Maybe it's not the same thing. Oh, no, there we go. Ooh, okay, that's a fun one. So we also do experiments in microgravity. So this one's a little more stuff is going on because we actually free float these boxes. So we take our experiment boxes into the airplane and release them. So they're floating in the airplane, so there's no forces acting on them. The camera is attached to the box, right? And if this is the thing that always blows my mind. So the box is floating in the plane and the airplane is moving. And it's actually like the airplane moves toward the box because the airplane's being controlled, right? So the box is just sort of floating. It's in free fall also, but then the airplane moves up and hits it. So our experiments usually end when we hit a wall or the ceiling or the floor, but really the floor is hitting us. So, but here we can replay it. I think I can, boop. Oh no, I lost my mouse. Okay, there. So this is a fun one because so this is actually JSC1, which is a lunar regolith simulant. It's really fine particles and it's actually really jagged, sort of like that picture I showed earlier. And you can see this marble hits the surface and it rebounds, and we get lots of interesting experiments where we see this, where it sort of hits and bounces off. So this is going pretty slowly. And you can see there's a sort of a little divot, a little crater that's left, but we don't actually see much material ejected. And so we sort of explore this range of what materials you have and what's coming in and hitting and how that affects how much material is thrown off, or if there's material that sticks to this impactor and things like that. So I think I have one more here, right, where we have this one. Oh, it stops a little early. This one, the marble comes down and hits, and it bounces off the surface, and you actually see a little bit of ejecta. So you can see there's a little bit of ejecta here. And then also, if we play the video a little bit longer, you see a little bit of this JSC that sticks to the surface. You also have all this other extra stuff that's sort of flying around because it's very hard to control dust. It sticks to things and does what it wants to do. So sometimes we have to sort of ignore this clump in the foreground that's floating around. But you can see that we get lots of different types of results when we do similar experiments where we're launching a marble, we're looking at the ejecta at similar speeds, but if we change the material, if we change the speeds, we actually see very different results. So we're trying to find sort of that range between where you see this ejecta and where it just bounces off the surface. And it seems like it's somewhere around 15 centimeters per second, so it's like pretty slow. But we actually have collisions like this on asteroids and in the solar system. So we can try to understand those a little bit better. Okay, I think that's the same one. It's like endless versions. There we go. Okay, this is a slide, but so we can do some simulations to try to understand those experiments as well. So I'm going to skip over most of this slide, but we also do simulations, numerical simulations, where we create little particles and do impacts into them to try to understand this. Part of the idea of that is then you can simulate asteroids or the moon and things like that as well, and look at how those surfaces change and try to figure out what's going to happen. We don't have a lot of actual observations from asteroid surfaces yet. We're working on it, obviously, but we're trying. So we can do a lot of modeling to try to understand them. But it's really nice always to have experiments and data to sort of root that modeling in truth, as opposed to just being like, sure, there's some particles on asteroids that stick together somehow. We don't really know how. Okay, so that's most of the stuff I'm going to talk about impacts. One of the other surface processes I talked about has to do with what's called electrostatics, or dust charging and levitation. So this is one of the fun riddles we like to explore if you study dust and the moon, like I do. And so this is, I titled it a riddle, the lunar horizon glow. Right, so if we're here on Earth, right, and we look out at sunset, or at sunrise, and there's a cloud near the horizon, right? That cloud will be illuminated by the sun oftentimes. Even if the sun is set below the horizon, right? It's sort of set, if you can still see light from a cloud get illuminated, right? So sometimes it's a fun color, but either way it gets illuminated. That's called like a backscattering effect that we can see as that light comes toward us from the sun. A similar thing, it turns out, happened in some of these images we have from the lunar surface. So these are actual images from the lunar surface from a couple of different robots called the Surveyor robots. They were just landers. They went and plopped down on the surface, and they basically had video cameras to record what they saw around them. And so they saw a bunch of stuff during the day, obviously, but they also saw these interesting features sometimes right after sunset or just before sunrise. So I think all of these are from just after sunset. So what we're looking at in all of these images, they're super great resolution, right? This was not an iPhone. It was a like old video camera, because this is in 1968, right? So although some of the images they have from like the Apollo astronauts that they used actual cameras, it has amazing resolution, right? Because it was actual film. So we have here on the surface, you have sort of, you can imagine the edge of the lunar surface, so the horizon line is somewhere a little bit below this glowy region. So somewhere here, here-ish. But then we saw this glowing stuff just above the edge of the horizon. And we call it the lunar horizon glow. But, right, I already mentioned on the lunar surface, there's no atmosphere, there aren't clouds. Right? So how does this happen? What do we get that is going to cause light to be scattered and hit toward the camera, and we can see the sort of glow above the surface?
Dust.
I'll give you a hint. It's probably dust, right? So we think it's probably dust. So it's a riddle, but because of the title of my talk, right, you probably already know what the answer is. But the question is, how does the dust get there, right? Why is there this lofted cloud sort of dust floating up above the surface? Is it floating above the surface? How does it get there? What is its structure? How big are the particles? There's so many questions, right? So we can do modeling based on the images we have here to sort of predict the sizes of the particles. Seems like they're probably around 10 microns, which is 10 to the minus 10 times 10 to the minus 6 meters, right? So very, very, very tiny particles, thinner than your hair, basically, or around the same size as the width of a hair. So very tiny particles that are lofted up above the surface and sort of form this cloud and glow. But the question is then, how do you get particles lofted up above the surface, sort of staying there? It might be due to impacts, right? So you could have an impact and sort of stuff stays lofted for a little while before it falls. Gravity's lower there, so it takes longer for things to fall down onto the surface. But there weren't any big impacts right around the time of these surveyor observations. So it's probably not just that. It might be some secondary impacts and a little bit of lofting, but modeling shows that it probably can't produce enough material to make these clouds. However, we think that it could be due to charged particles getting sort of lifted up above the surface, floating around, and then falling back down. So how would that happen? Super complicated image. So this is a complex image, and I'm not going to talk about all of the things happening on it, but the idea of this is that there's this really complex interaction between the moon and asteroids and any airless body in space, spacecraft even, and the sort of space environment. So anywhere in the solar system, and especially in the inner solar system, you have a surface that's exposed to space, and we think, okay, space is like a vacuum, right? But it turns out that in the solar system, a lot of space is charged particles. So there's this thing called the sun, right? That's big beast in the solar system, and it produces what's called the solar wind. So the solar wind is just charged particles that are streaming off the sun at all times, right? And spreading out into space. And so they have really interesting structure of the way the solar wind moves, and it has to do with magnetic field lines, but mostly we care about the fact that it's these charged particles, so electrons and ions, that are coming off the sun and hitting any of these surfaces that we see. So spacecraft, planetary surfaces, all get these electrons and ions that come to the surface and charge the surface. We also have light from the sun, right? High energy light and UV and X-ray that can cause what's called photoemission. So if you have high energy light hitting the surface, it can actually cause the surface to emit electrons. And so you get this interesting population of electrons and ions just above the surface and on the surface of the moon or an asteroid that causes particles to be charged and causes electric fields. So when we think about these surfaces, right, we looked at those surfaces earlier where you had big topography differences, but you also have what's called the terminator. Ooh. Right? Which is a very scary name. That's just the line between day and night on the sun. I actually don't know why it's called the terminator region. I guess that's where you're terminating daylight, or terminating night, depending on if you're a glass half empty or half full kind of person, I guess. But so this terminator region is this line between day and night. And it's actually pretty sharp in a lot of areas because, again, there's no atmosphere, there's not as much diffraction and things like that. But in some areas you get really complex things. So turns out if you're on the day side, the surface tends to be more positively charged, and if you're on the night side, it tends to be more negatively charged. And if you have a positive thing and a negative thing, you can actually get an electric field that goes in between them. So we think that there's these really complicated electric fields that form on planetary surfaces that have to do with whether it's illuminated by the sun or whether it's in the darkness. And this is true on spacecraft too. So we have really interesting charging effects that happen on spacecraft if they're in the sun or if they're in like the shadow of the Earth. Oh, there's so many things. There's lots of different types of particles. They're all coming up one by one. There we go. Okay, so we think that there's these interesting regions between day and night, or due to topography, right, you get the shadowing effect, where you can actually get, if a particle has a little, let's say it has a little negative charge, and it's on a positively charged part of the surface, it's going to get booted off, and maybe, or it's on a negatively charged part of the surface, it's going to get booted off and go toward the positively charged part of the surface. So we think you can actually get particles sort of hopping off the surface and moving around as an effect of having this difference between day and night, and also other local effects. This is complicated and really hard to explain for some of the observations we see, but it fits with some of the observations, the other observations that we see. Your question?
Can you detect these sort of fields on Earth?
So the question is, can you detect these electric fields on Earth? So we definitely see these electric fields sort of like in the lab when we make this sort of surface. And you do get things like that happening like to spacecraft up in the ionosphere. On Earth, most of our, so here we are in this room, right? The atmosphere mitigates all of that charging that we have. So the atmosphere on Earth protects us from the solar wind, right? So all of the charged particle stuff happens in the upper part of the atmosphere. Unless you're talking about like lightning, right? That's a bunch of charged particle stuff. And so we are protected on Earth from these effects by the atmosphere. But there are certain regions, like right when different things happen with your power and with those cables, you can get a lot of weird charged particle effects. But so on the sun, or on asteroids and on the moon, you don't have this atmosphere to protect you and to sort of mitigate the charge, right? In Florida, I can like walk around and shuffle my feet and then touch something and not get shocked, right? Most of the time. Or you can like rub a balloon on your head and it like doesn't actually always stick very well because Florida has a lot of humidity also is the other thing, right? Humidity tends to like get rid of charged particles, and so it's harder to stick a balloon to your head than it was in like Colorado. I lived in Colorado for a while and it's super dry there and I got shocked all the time. It was annoying. Okay, that's an aside. But yeah, so dust motion we think is probably due to these electric fields on the surface. There's some big questions about sort of how this happens. So it fits some models that we have and it fits some observations like that horizon glow we saw. But there's some observations of dust that we see very high up. And we don't really know how it gets that high, how it gets accelerated to such high altitudes. And so there's still a lot of questions and a lot of measurements we need to do on planetary surfaces to understand that better. But it would help explain some things that we see, like these ponds on the surface of Eros, where you see lots of little particles that are sort of falling down into a crater. We have models that show that you can actually get dust hopping up above the surface and landing in craters because of the structure of the electric field in those areas. So it's possible that this is some combination of gravitational sorting and these electric fields. Okay, I'm going to skip the next slide. This is just a fun other picture of a little lunar dust grain particle. They're very complex, so you can get really complex electric fields even on the dust grains themselves. And then this is a fun experiment that some of my colleagues at Colorado did, where they had a bunch of little dust grains in a little mini crater in the lab in a vacuum chamber. And then they put an electron beam and a plasma on it, so they made charged particles impinge on the surface, and they actually saw little dust grains, this is a traced image, hopping up above the surface. So we can actually show this in the lab as well. And you can see you have these little rough surfaces here and all these little grains, and that wasn't just from them being messy when they were putting it in, right? Those actually hopped out of the sides of the crater. So we have these really complex surfaces. Another way we might explain some of the things we see on planetary bodies, though, is like landslides, much more. So the next couple, the rest of these slides are going to be about other sort of big surface feature modifications that we can get. So, so this is a landslide on Earth, right? So we see them here on Earth, yeah.
Okay, so you wouldn't really have definite poles, so if you took like a compass or whatever, it went there, you would just be going crazy?
Oh, yeah, so that's a question. So he's asking about if you took a compass, right, to the moon or to an asteroid, would you be able to tell like which way is north or something like that, right? And that's a complicated answer, but most basically no. So the magnetic field on Earth, though, is generated from inside, right? So it has to do with this sort of magnet we have on the inside of the Earth that tells us which direction things go. And it can get complicated by different electric fields and stuff like that. And so if you're somewhere on like an asteroid or the moon, you get lots of little localized magnetic fields and weird electric fields too that are going to throw you off. Yeah, I used to work at space camp when I was younger, and we had a fun exercise of like, if you were on the moon, what would you want to take with you? And like a compass is not one of them. It's not going to be very useful. Also not like matches, because there's no oxygen to light a match. It's complicated questions. So we see landslides, right, on the Earth, and we also see them on other planetary bodies. So this is a picture from Ceres, the asteroid Ceres, where you see this actual big, giant sort of chunk came out, and this was a big slope failure, a big landslide that happened. Maybe it was due to an impact, but probably it was due to some sort of structural failure, maybe vibrations, things like that. We also see, this is on the moon, you had this crater that formed, and it was probably sort of this big initially, but then you had all of this mass motion and landsliding that happened due to some other failure later on after the crater had initially formed. So we see lots of these types of features on different bodies, and I have just sort of a montage. Ooh, that's a fun rotating one. I have a montage of different types of images. This is actually a comet, right? It has very complicated features. You think about comets, they're icy, dusty material, so you can actually get really different landslides that happen due to melting. Sometimes they have steam coming off of them. Here's a really cool landslide feature we see on, I think that's also on a comet, I think that's on 67P. But these kinds of features are on the moon and asteroids as well. And you can see you get these really interesting landslide and scour features on lots of different types of surfaces. So we're actually doing some experiments to try to understand that a little bit as well. And these pictures are nowhere near as cool as the other ones. Although most of my pictures, right, are black and white, so at least there's color here. Planetary bodies, turns out, mostly gray. So they're not super exciting. Sometimes we put false color on them to make them more interesting. But so we can do experiments again in different gravity levels to try to understand when you have landslides occur and how those slopes are affected on different surfaces. So we can do, this was an experiment that was done looking at if you have different gravity levels, so very low gravity or sort of Mars gravity, what material will look like as it slides down on a surface, and you actually can get much steeper cliffs kind of in low gravity, right? Because you don't have those forces sort of pulling them down. But it turns out the little cohesiveness between the grains that we talked about earlier also matters. So those jagged grains sticking together can make a much steeper cliff even than like if you just had a bunch of spheres on the surface. So it gets very complicated. We also look at effects that are due to vibrations. So you have a lot of impacts and also some seismic activity on some of these bodies. And what's called the Brazil nut effect. So this is an effect that's observed because they used to ship crates of different types of mixed nuts, I guess, right? And the Brazil nuts always seem to end up on top. So Brazil nuts are sort of big chunks, right? And it turns out that when you vibrate things in a container, so you have your granola here, right? And different types of things, they sort out in the package. That's because when you have these vibrations, smaller things sort of actually stay in place, and you get this convective motion that will move larger things up to the top of the surface. So that's called the Brazil nut effect. And we see it a lot here on Earth, and we have lots of models of it. And we think that may be causing some of what we see on these asteroid surfaces. So we see a lot of these big particles that are sort of stuck on the top of asteroid surfaces. That's possibly because you have sort of vibrations and shaking that are moving the big particles up to the surface, and you have the smaller stuff then stuck underneath. So it's going to look like this, where you have a large boulder up here on the top, but it's actually hiding all of the smaller stuff underneath. So we're doing some experiments now up on the space station, on the ISS, to try to understand this a little bit better. And I have a video in just a second, but we have these different tubes we put in. A lot of times we use simulants that are just spherical or that are really well-known materials because they're easier to model. So if we're doing numerical simulations, we want to be able to match those up with what we observe. So we use spheres, but then we also use real simulants in some of these where we develop them at UCF or wherever, and we use simulants. Or this one of the tubes we put up there, we actually took a meteorite that had fallen to the Earth from space. We hit it with a sledgehammer and broke it up and then sent it back to space in a tube. So, but then it came back. So we also destroyed a meteorite for this experiment. It's okay. So these are little videos of this sort of size sorting that we think we see. So we put these experiments, there's just tubes of simulant up on the space station, and we let them sit there. So it turns out, though, the space station, it's a pretty quiet environment. It's very low gravity, right? They're always in free fall. But there's all sorts of activities they do. There's all sorts of vibration on the station itself that causes motion that we see. And when we set these tubes up, we kind of didn't expect to see much, but it turns out we see tons of motion all the time. And so we're trying to analyze this data to see what sort of motion we see. Do we see like convection, these things sort of rolling around, right? This metal bar is on the outside of the tube, by the way. And so these are different sizes of particles. How do they sort themselves? How does it affected by how much vibration there is on the surface? And then the final video, it's again black and white and gray because That's what we look at, right? Is, it's sort of hard to see here. But you can see that we also look at these simulant materials. And these behave very, very differently because we have a lot of those really fine materials in it. And there's also real sort of particle shapes, not those glass beads that we see. So on the left, it's sort of hard to see, but you sort of see this motion and moving around, and you can see it's clumpy down here. And there's no event in this one, which just means that there's no big change in the structure. Versus this one, where it's a looping video. So it'll loop, and you see, so it sort of starts off here, and then at some point we think that there's a big jostle, and you see this big breakup, and the chunk falls off and gets sort of absorbed in with the other particles. So we're using these types of experiments to also try to understand how sorting happens on asteroid surfaces and how the different particles move around on the moon and on asteroid surfaces. So I'll go back to the colored one and leave it going for now because it's bright colors and all the rest of my slides were black and white. And then I'm happy to take any questions.
So if you had a can of mixed nuts
Yes.
on the space station,
The astronauts would be pretty happy.
where would the Brazil nuts end up in the can?
So that's a great question. So the question is, right, if you took that same jar of mixed nuts with peanuts and Brazil nuts and whatever, maybe not peanuts, I don't know if you're allowed to have peanuts on the space station. But it's a good question, right? So, but where would the Brazil nuts end up? So on Earth, they always end up at the top because it turns out gravity has a big influence and you sort of get convection. So it's the same thing, right? When like water boils in your pot, that's convection. Convective motion moves things up. That same thing that is moving the Brazil nuts up in here on Earth. And that's opposite gravity, right? So on the space station, which way gravity is pointing is actually a super complicated question, and it varies based sort of like on what day it is and if there's a Soyuz docked to it or not. So somewhere in the tube. So I think, so it would be a lot more like this, right? Where you see the bigger particles sort of moving around at different times in different places. We expect that unless you have like a vibration in one direction, one specific direction, you're not going to see, and if you made the vibration in a specific direction, you might then be able to see. But that's one of the questions we have is like, if you don't have strong gravity, what does that motion look like? It might be very different.
The different color particles the same density?
They're all glass in this case. So they're different, they're the same density, they're just different sizes. So the green ones are large, like, the blue ones are medium and the red ones are small. The red ones for scale are about 2 millimeters roughly. The blue are 5 and the green are 10, I think, ish. Maybe not quite like size. Maybe it was, 2, 5, and 10, I think. Did you have a question?
If you shape it, then does it have a different effect than if you just put a vibration on it?
Yeah, it probably would. So the question is, right, if you, I think I lost my mic. If you shake it, I can just be loud. If you shake it, are you going to have a different effect than if you just put like a little vibrating motor on it? And that's a great question. And the answer is probably yes. It turns out that if you shake a thing in a preferential direction, you can cause sort of motion in that direction versus just having like a vibrating motor. But that's one of the things we're going to try to explore on the next round of this. We're putting like a couple little cell phone motors in to make the vibration we want. And then we can also do a little jostling motion where we poke it and see if that affects any of those things. Yes?
You said this was applicable for the rocks on Earth?
Mm-hmm.
That you can measure how the rocks are generally higher?
Mm-hmm.
Bigger rocks generally higher? How would you have a shaking effect on Earth?
So on Earth, we don't, so you can see this, I'm going to actually go off this one because I think it's using all my battery. So let's go back to like a pretty picture. On Earth, we see it in like small scale experiments. So like when let's go to like Itokawa or something. So we see it in small scale experiments on Earth where we're actually controlling it. And you see it sometimes actually if you go out to like a rock field, you can actually see that happening. But mostly these kinds of things we see on asteroid surfaces. On Earth, it's a very different thing, but I think you can see it sometimes when you have a lot of like seismic activity, you might get that kind of sorting. But if you like went home and took a bunch of different sized particles and stuck them in a container and shook it, you would see the similar effect.
From
Mm-hmm.
a couple different asteroids, but do you know if it's like silica or iron?
Yeah. Yeah, so the question, right, is what is the composition of a lot of these materials? So you notice I didn't talk much about composition, and that's because I am not a chemist, I'm not a composition person, but I do know some basic stuff. So asteroids that we're going to, so Ryugu and Bennu, tend to be what are called C-type asteroids, which means that they're mostly silicates, so there are a lot of silicon materials, which it turns out most of the stuff in the solar system is. Most of the rocks are a lot of silicates, but you also have a lot of carbonaceous material, so carbon-like compounds on these surfaces as well. So a lot of times when we do experiments, we do them with like sand or other silica because it's very representative of the material we see. But if you have things like carbon compounds, it might actually make them clump together and behave very differently. So that's a big question, is sort of what materials we see and also how are they put together, because that can tell us a little bit about some of the different processes that have moved them around and affected them. But we have to wait like 8 years to find out, I think. I forget when. I think OREX comes back in 2023. So it's only like 5 years. I forget when Hayabusa gets back, but yeah.
How do these things form?
Oh,
Impact on
great
a
question.
planet or
So you're talking about the moon or an asteroid?
an asteroid?
Okay. So there's lots of different, so one of the other things we do when we do these low velocity impacts actually is try to understand planet formation. So early on in the solar system, you have a lot of particles moving around, and some things happen due to really large impacts. So you get things slamming into each other, breaking stuff apart, bringing stuff together. And sometimes those really big impacts form bigger bodies. So we think the moon formed from a pretty large thing slamming into the Earth, breaking off a chunk of it that sort of coalesced back together to form the moon. Rubble pile asteroids, on the other hand, right, probably come together due to some large breakup event, but then you have a lot of these materials together that sort of clump together eventually and coalesce. That might partly be by these really low velocity collisions that we study, where you have some things sort of moving along and they sort of run into each other. And statistically, they're going to break apart or bounce off, but sometimes they have just the right energy and they'll stick together. And then maybe you have another one that comes on and sticks onto that, and you get these rubble piles that sort of form. But
That's a rubble pile?
we think Itokawa is a rubble pile, probably, yeah. So so part of the reason we know that also is not just from like looking at the surface, it's really hard to tell from the surface, but we can get estimates of sort of its density. And so it has a really low density, like lower than if it was one solid rock, which tells us there's a lot of porosity in it, and that's probably due to the fact that it's lots of rocks sort of smooshed together as opposed to one solid thing.
These asteroids would be moving at different speeds, so.
Mhm.
Can you intercept like a free-floating asteroid as well as you can intercept like a satellite?
Yes and no. So asteroids are also orbiting around the sun, just like most of the other things in the solar system. A lot of asteroids are in sort of a region in between Mars and Jupiter, right? They have pretty typical orbits, and there are some asteroids that are closer. So near-Earth asteroids, or near-Earth objects are closer. Those are the ones that are a lot of the ones we're going to right now. So they're on orbits that we can predict and we know. And so you plan a spacecraft mission just like you would, similar to you would plan a mission to the moon or Mars, where you say, okay, I'm going to go to this object. I plan my trajectory to get to it. The tricky thing is, though, when we go to the moon or Mars, it has a lot of gravity and will capture the spacecraft, right? So it goes into orbit and it can go then in orbit around that body. When we go to something like an asteroid that's only hundreds or tens of meters across, right? That can't capture the spacecraft into orbit around it with its gravity. You sort of do what's called a parking orbit, where you're actually just orbiting along with it. So your spacecraft goes up and it sort of gets near that asteroid and then just sort of follows it in its orbit. So it doesn't actually orbit the asteroid, but it's right next to it and can take observations. The tricky thing is landing on the surface is also very hard, because you have to like go really slow to approach it, and you can't really like grapple on, because there's not really much to grapple onto, right? So there's a lot of those techniques that we're still trying to understand. So all of the missions, so OREX and Hayabusa, for their sample returns, are both sort of going up, touching it, grabbing a sample real quick, and then going away.
So if there's an asteroid heading towards Earth, it would be very unlikely to land on it?
So if there's asteroids heading towards Earth, there are not any that we know of right now. Well, odds are there is one somewhere, right? None that we've detected, but we actually have a lot of people trying to study that. We could send a spacecraft to it. It probably wouldn't land on it. unless it was a big asteroid. Yeah.
Then would it be easy to just like blow it up or something?
So that's a lot of the reason we want to understand sort of the shapes of these things and how they're put together and what they're made out of, right? Because like if you put a bomb or something, an explosive in the surface of this asteroid, right? But it's just sort of loosely held together stuff. It's not going to actually do much. It's not going to blow it apart the way you want it to. It might just sort of separate it all, but then it's still all coming in the same direction for you on Earth. So you have lots of little impacts as opposed to one big one. So that's part of the reason we want to understand these, is like so we know how to deflect them in case they come toward us.
So what would you do instead of blowing it up?
Great question. Still working on that one.
Some like rockets on it and like.
That's one. There was one mission that was going to sort of go and sort of try to gravity tractor an asteroid. So asteroids are very small, and your spacecraft is sort of big, and you can actually tug it a little bit with the spacecraft's gravity. For something bigger, it's going to be harder. So we don't really have an answer yet. We got smart people working on it, though. Yeah.
I saw a graphic where the asteroid was spinning.
Yeah.
Are any of them just like floating?
Sort of not rotating? No. No, they're not. So the Earth rotates sort of once a day, right? That's by definition. But asteroids, a lot of them rotate at like 6-hour periods or shorter. Some of them are a little bit longer, some of them are shorter. So they rotate pretty fast. Some of them are very chaotic. So some of them rotate sort of along the way the Earth does, perpendicular to its orbit, but some of them are sort of doing all sorts of crazy things. Itokawa, for instance, right? It's a giant potato that's just sort of flopping around. It has a very strange spin axis. And so they sort of rotate with these very strange speeds and also angles.
All right, thank you very much.
No problem.